As we enter the fantasy football playoffs, like we do every single year, we have more questions than we have answers when it comes to the running back position. For example, what do we do with Zach Charbonnet if Kenneth Walker returns this week? What about Isaiah Guerrero, who exited last Sunday's contest with a possible foot sprain? With an opportunity to advance, does Israel Abakanda become the hero we never knew that we needed? Fantasy managers, you can breathe a sigh of relief this week with the return of Derrick Henry, Joe Mixon, Jonathan Taylor, Rhamondre Stevenson, and Brian Robinson Jr., who were all absent last week due to having their byes. However, there are some backs out there who are poised to produce here in Week 15 that are not amongst the elite. But we also have to note that there is a running back there in Jonathan Brooks. Let's pour one out for the young fella there. Re-tore his ACL on Sunday, and he has to go through the entire recovery process once again. Win and you advance, lose and your season could come to an end. Let RotoBaller help you with those problematic lineup decisions with our Week 15 running back starts and sits. And first off, we are starting the aforementioned Brian Robinson Jr. The last time that we saw Robinson Jr. in action was back in week number 13 when he churned out 103 yards on the ground and 17 fantasy points on 16 rushing attempts against the Tennessee Titans. And quietly, Robinson has put together a pretty impressive fantasy resume this season despite missing time due to injury. In 10 games this year, the Commanders' back has produced double-digit fantasy production on 8 occasions, averaging 13.5 fantasy points per game. Robinson and the Commanders, they head on down to the Bayou for a date with the New Orleans Saints this week. The Saints defense that has allowed 1,787 total yards to running backs this season, allowing running backs to reach pay dirt on 15 separate occasions. New Orleans has allowed the 8th most fantasy production this season to the position, and over the last 4 weeks, they have allowed 23.73 fantasy points per game. With Austin Eckler once again sidelined, look for Robinson to play a larger part of this offense. In Week 13, Robinson accounted for just 47% of the backfield snaps as he worked himself back into the lineup. With a favorable matchup on the docket, look for Robinson to add to his 640 rushing yards, 8 touchdowns, and an impressive 4.6 yards per carry average so far. Another running back that you're starting this week, how about David Montgomery against the Buffalo Bills? When you play in a top-ranked offense, and you face a defense that has allowed 1,339 rushing yards and a league-high 579 receiving yards to backs, not to mention 27.22 fantasy points per game, you're going to find yourself front and center in many fantasy lineups this week, as David Montgomery is certainly going to do. Now, Kyren Williams, he may have only had a pair of receptions for 10 yards, but what Williams did on the ground against the Bills is something that Montgomery is more than capable of repeating. Last week, Williams ran the ball 29 times for 87 yards and a pair of touchdowns. Now, I doubt Montgomery's going to get that kind of volume, but his efficiency this season should allow him to meet that production, if not exceed it with his limited opportunities. Now, Montgomery and Jahmyr Gibbs are the only running back tandem that has each produced more than 1,000 yards from scrimmage this season. Montgomery, he's responsible for 1,081 total yards this season, while his backfield mate has produced 1,328 himself. That's not great news for a Buffalo Bills team that just had 44 points hung on them a week ago. Only Kyren Williams has had more red zone carries this season than Montgomery's 49, which he has turned into 12 touchdowns. Of Montgomery's 214.2 fantasy points this season, 92.5 of them have come via red zone opportunities. And if I was a betting man, I'd bet on more red zone opportunities this week for David Montgomery. The third running back I'm starting this week, how about Rhamondre Stevenson? And let's say it like we mean it, Rhamondre Stevenson, as they take on the Arizona Cardinals. If you're looking for a riskier play that offers you some potential high-end rewards, look no further than Rhamondre Stevenson, who faces the Cardinals front that has allowed 12 touchdowns this season to opposing backs. Arizona has also allowed 1,362 rushing yards in 14 contests, and they've also surrendered 509 receiving yards on 66 receptions this season. The risk comes from the fact that Arizona, over the last few weeks, they've actually played pretty good, limiting running backs there to just 188 yards on 50 attempts while allowing just 1 touchdown, which happened to be in the passing game. Stevenson has been the ultimate running back roulette player there, as his 7 touchdowns are the 19th most amongst the running back position, but they kind of come and go in spurts. New England has very little going for them offensively, but with Drake May under center, they have been much better. Since week number 7, when Stevenson returned to the lineup with Drake May, Stevenson has produced 87.7 fantasy points and is the RB20 over that period. So you have yourself a very solid RB2 this week. Now those sits, how about Travis Etienne of the Jacksonville Jaguars as they take on the New York Jets? touches and opportunities, they matter. And Tank Bigsby in week number 14, he led the way for this Jaguars backfield, finishing with 19 touches compared to Etienne's 9. Before last week's 82% of rushing attempts, not to mention the only carry inside the 10-yard line, Bigsby had yet to see a share greater than 65% in any contest in which Etienne was healthy and available. With the real-life toilet bowl playing out before our very eyes this week, it wouldn't shock me if Bigsby continues to out-touch Etienne as this Jaguars brass continues to evaluate what they have on this roster. The NFL is a what have you done for me lately business, and the truth is, Etienne, he hasn't done much. This season, the Jaguars' former 25th overall selection has just one game in which he has totaled over 60 yards. Etienne, he hit that milestone 12 times in each of the previous 2 seasons. New York held Devin Etienne to 24 rushing yards on 14 carries last week. So unless Etienne is going to get work in the passing game, it's really hard to imagine a scenario in which fantasy managers can trust inserting him back into their lineups this week. The other running back that I will not be inserting in my lineup this week is DeAndre Swift of the Chicago Bears as they take on the Minnesota Vikings. Since Shane Waldron's dismissal, we have seen a shift in offensive philosophy for this Bears team. DeAndre Swift has now been held to less than 10 fantasy points in 3 consecutive contests, averaging 35.7 rushing yards and 2.8 yards per carry per game. Throughout the season, Swift has had an astonishing 9 games in which he's been held to less than 4 yards per carry, which is less than ideal. Look, the volume, it is there. There's no disputing that. So despite the lack of production in the last 3 games, Swift has a 90% running back share out of this Bears backfield. We're getting a big volume here as far as the share, but we're not getting fantasy points, and you can't trust that kind of volume with that lack of production heading into your fantasy playoffs. Over the last 4 weeks, the Minnesota Vikings have allowed just 195 yards on 63 attempts. That works out to about 3.14 yards per carry. Swift, he would need roughly 30 carries or more to reach double-digit fantasy production there, compared to what we're seeing from this defense, compared to what we know what Swift is capable of doing. And you know what? I'm not betting on that. And the Vikings, they've been stout against opposing backs, limiting them to just 17.97 fantasy points per game. That is the 4th fewest. Now, on the flip side, they've allowed a league worst 40.82 fantasy points per game to the wide receiver position. With that disparity in fantasy production, it is safe to assume that Chicago is likely going to attack through the air rather than the ground. And the final running back I'm sitting this week is Nick Chubb of the Cleveland Browns as they take on the Kansas City Chiefs. The only way in which I'm going to be wrong about this selection is if Jerry Jeudy and or David Njoku are tackled on the 1-yard line multiple times. We are here in week number 15, and Nick Chubb is averaging 3.1 yards per carry this season. In the 7 games that Chubb has played since his return, it has taken him 20 attempts to reach his season high of 59 rushing yards. This is Jameis Winston's world, and we are all just living in it. Winston has attempted 40 or more passes in all but 1 game in his 6 starts this season. Expect everything to be the same this week as Kansas City has allowed 776 rushing yards on 226 rushing attempts. That's about 3.4 yards per carry there. Now, fantasy points, we know they are difficult to come by for running backs against this Chiefs team, and rightfully so. I mean, we're talking about a team that is allowing a league low 14.86 fantasy points against the season, turning many game scripts one-dimensional. And with the Browns' commitment to the passing game, I don't even know if they're going to even bother trying to run the ball against this Chiefs team. So with that being said, hey, you want answers? We got them here at RotoBaller, so head over to rotoballer.com for all the latest news and analysis. If you got start-sit questions, head over to the Discord channel, and I'll be there answering away. See you next time.